He wasn't supposed to notice the dog at all. On most winter mornings in the Colorado high country, drivers kept their eyes on the road and their hands tied on the wheel, especially when the snow came down sideways like it did that morning. The sky hung low and pale over the mountains, and the Tulane highway stretched empty for miles, a narrow ribbon of dark asphalt cutting through endless fields of white. Staff Sergeant Daniel Carter eased his pickup along the icy shoulder at barely 20 miles an hour, the heater humming softly while the windshield wipers brushed away the steady curtain of snow. The scent of pine drifted faintly through the cracked window, sharp and cold, the kind of air that reminded a man he was far from cities and closer to something older and quieter. Daniel had driven this road dozens of times since leaving the Marine Corps the year before. The silence of the mountains helped him think, or sometimes helped him stop thinking at all. But then he saw it. At first it looked like nothing more than a dark shape near the edge of the snowbank, just another shadow among the drifts. Then the shape moved slightly. Not walking, not running, sitting. Daniel slowed the truck even more, squinting through the swirling flakes. About 30 yards off the road, in a clearing of untouched snow, sat a German shepherd. The dog was perfectly still. No pacing, no barking, just sitting upright, its body half covered in powder, its thick coat dusted white along the back and ears. Its head faced the forest behind it, not the road, not the truck. Almost like it was waiting for something deep in the trees. Daniel felt the strange tug of instinct he had learned to trust long ago. Marines spent years reading silence, reading small details others missed. And something about the dog's posture felt wrong. Dogs didn't sit alone in snowstorms unless they had a reason. He eased the truck to the side of the road and put it in park. The engine idled softly as he opened the door. The wind hit him first, sharp and biting, the kind that slipped through jackets and settled into your bones. His boots crunched against the frozen gravel as he stepped out. "Hey there," he called gently, his voice carried away by the wind. The dog didn't move. Daniel walked a few more steps toward it, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. Up close, he could see the animal clearly now. The shepherd was large, strong-built, its dark sable coat thick against the cold. Snow clung to its muzzle and shoulders, yet the dog showed no sign of distress. Its ears were upright, alert. Its eyes, amber and steady, were fixed on the forest. Not once did the dog bark. Not once did it run toward him like most dogs would when they spotted a stranger. Instead, after several seconds of silence, the shepherd slowly turned its head. It looked directly at Daniel. There was no fear in its gaze. No aggression either. Just a calm, focused intensity, the kind Daniel had seen in trained working dogs during his years overseas. Then the dog stood. It took 3 slow steps toward the trees. Stopped. Looked back at him. Waited. The wind moved through the pines with a low whisper, carrying the faint scent of frozen earth and something else Daniel couldn't quite place yet. The dog walked a few more yards into the forest, then paused again, glancing back over its shoulder. In that quiet moment, Daniel realized something simple but unmistakable. The dog wasn't wandering. It was leading him somewhere. Daniel Carter hesitated only a moment before stepping off the roadside and into the snow. The cold reached halfway up his boots with the first step, the powder dry and deep from the night storm. The wind moved quietly through the tall pines ahead, bending their dark branches in slow motion like the forest itself was breathing. 30 yards ahead, the German shepherd waited near the tree line. The dog did not pace or bark. It simply stood there with the calm patience of something that understood time differently than humans did. When Daniel moved closer, the dog turned again and walked deeper into the woods. Daniel followed. The forest swallowed the sound of the highway almost immediately. Within 20 seconds, the world behind him vanished into white silence. The only sound now was the soft crunch of his boots and the steady whisper of falling snow. The shepherd kept moving at an easy pace, never too far ahead. Every few steps it glanced back, its amber eyes checking that Daniel was still there. Daniel had spent 12 years in the Marine Corps. He had walked through deserts, jungles, and mountain valleys where a single wrong step could mean trouble. Instinct told him this was not random behavior. This was guidance. The dog wanted him to see something. They moved perhaps 50 yards into the trees before Daniel noticed the first sign that something was different. Tracks. Not just the dog's prints. Human footprints too, half filled with snow. Daniel crouched for a moment, brushing away the powder with his glove. The tracks were uneven and scattered, as if someone had been walking carefully through the drifts hours earlier. The edges were already soft from wind and snowfall. Old, but not too old. Daniel stood again and looked ahead. The shepherd had stopped beside a fallen pine tree that leaned at an angle between two larger trunks. The dog lowered its head slightly and gave a quiet breath through its nose. Not a bark, not a growl. Just a low sound that carried urgency. Daniel stepped forward carefully. The air beneath the trees felt colder somehow, heavier, as if the snow had sealed the forest into its own quiet world. Then he saw it. Beneath the fallen tree, partially sheltered by its branches, lay a man wrapped in a thick winter coat. At first the figure looked completely still, almost part of the snow itself. A dusting of white covered the sleeves and shoulders. One gloved hand rested against the frozen ground. The man's backpack lay nearby, half buried in powder. Daniel moved quickly now, kneeling beside him. He brushed snow gently from the man's chest and leaned close, listening. For a moment there was nothing but wind moving through the branches above. Then Daniel heard it. A faint breath, slow and shallow, but steady enough to tell him the man was still alive. Daniel exhaled quietly, relief mixing with concern. The shepherd stepped closer, its posture calm but watchful. The dog lowered itself beside the man and pressed its body against his side, sharing warmth without being told. Daniel looked at the animal for a moment, understanding something simple and powerful all at once. This dog had not left him. Not through the night. Not through the snow. Daniel removed one glove and gently checked the man's pulse at the wrist. It was weak but present. He glanced up toward the gray sky visible through the branches. The snow was still falling, and the temperature would only drop as the day moved forward. Daniel knew the truth immediately. Help was miles away, and the road was already fading behind the storm. For now, in this silent forest of pine and snow, there were only 3 of them. Daniel Carter pulled his glove back on and sat for a moment in the quiet snow, studying the situation with the calm patience that years in uniform had carved into him. The man beneath the fallen tree was breathing, but the breaths were slow and shallow, the kind that came from a body already worn down by cold and exhaustion. The wind moved through the pine branches above them with a long, hollow whisper, and flakes of snow drifted steadily downward, settling on the dark fabric of the man's coat before melting into damp patches. Daniel carefully brushed the snow away from the man's collar and leaned closer again, listening. The breath was still there, faint, but steady enough to hold hope. The German shepherd shifted beside the man, pressing its thick body gently against him as if it understood that warmth mattered more than anything else right now. Daniel watched the dog for a moment. Its amber eyes were calm, alert, and steady, not wild with panic like most animals would be in a storm like this. This dog had chosen to stay. That much was clear. Daniel exhaled slowly and looked around the small clearing beneath the trees. The forest felt heavier now, quieter than before, the falling snow muting every distant sound. He reached for the zipper of his heavy canvas jacket and pulled it open, shrugging it off despite the cold biting instantly through the layers beneath. Carefully, he folded the jacket and laid it across the man's chest and shoulders, tucking the sides around him to trap what little warmth they could share. The man stirred slightly at the contact, a faint movement that lasted only a second before stillness returned. Daniel leaned closer. "Stay with us," he said quietly, his voice calm and steady, the way Marines learned to speak when everything around them felt uncertain. The dog lifted its head and looked at him, ears forward, as if it understood every word. Daniel scanned the ground again and noticed the backpack half buried in the snow. He reached over and pulled it closer, brushing away the powder. The pack was sturdy, the kind hikers carried for long winter trails. Daniel opened it carefully and began checking inside. A thermos, a small emergency blanket, a few energy bars sealed in plastic. Whoever this man was, he had prepared for the cold. But something must have gone wrong on the trail. Daniel closed the pack again and looked toward the gray sky through the branches. The snowfall had grown heavier since he stepped into the woods. Visibility beyond the trees was already fading into white haze. The highway where he had parked the truck might only be 100 yards away, but it felt like a different world now. His phone would not work out here. These mountains swallowed signals as easily as they swallowed sound. Daniel rested one hand against the fallen tree and thought carefully, measuring options the same way he had done 100 times before in places far more dangerous than this. Leaving the man alone was not an option, not with the temperature falling and the storm building. He glanced at the dog again. The shepherd had lowered its head beside the man's shoulder, its body curved protectively around him, sharing warmth without hesitation. Snow had gathered along the dog's back, but it did not seem to notice. Daniel gave a small nod, almost to himself. "All right," he said softly into the quiet forest. "We stay." The wind sighed through the pines again, and somewhere deeper in the woods a branch creaked under the weight of snow. In that silent moment, Daniel understood something simple and powerful. The dog had already made the same decision hours ago. The storm thickened slowly, the way mountain weather often did, quiet at first, and then suddenly everywhere at once. Snow fell heavier through the tall pines, the flakes drifting sideways as the wind began to gather strength between the ridges. Daniel Carter stood for a moment beside the fallen tree, studying the forest around them the way he once studied unfamiliar terrain during long patrols overseas. Every decision mattered now, even the smallest ones. He crouched again beside the man and gently adjusted the jacket he had wrapped around him, making sure the fabric covered the chest and shoulders completely. The man's breathing was still there, faint but steady, each slow breath forming a thin cloud in the cold air before fading away. The German shepherd remained pressed close to him, its thick coat acting like a living blanket. The dog lifted its head briefly when Daniel moved, its amber eyes watching him with calm focus, as if measuring every action. Daniel reached out and placed a gloved hand lightly against the dog's neck. The fur was cold on the surface, but warm beneath. "Good dog," he said quietly. The shepherd's ears twitched at the sound of his voice, but it did not move away from the man. Daniel opened the backpack again and removed the silver emergency blanket. The thin material crackled softly as he unfolded it, the reflective surface catching the gray winter light filtering through the branches above. Carefully, he draped it over the man and tucked the edges beneath the jacket, sealing in what little warmth they could create together. The wind sighed through the forest again, stronger this time, carrying the faint scent of snow and frozen earth. Daniel looked toward the direction of the road, though he could no longer see it through the thick trees and falling snow. It was somewhere beyond the white curtain, maybe 100 yards away, maybe more. Distance felt different in weather like this. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, holding it up for a moment. The screen showed exactly what he expected. No signal. These mountains had a way of swallowing the outside world when storms rolled through. Daniel slipped the phone back into his pocket and rubbed his hands together briefly, forcing warmth back into his fingers. The temperature was dropping quickly now. He could feel it in the tightening air, in the way the snow no longer melted when it touched his jacket. He knew the signs. Years of field training never left a man completely. He glanced down at the dog again. The shepherd had shifted slightly closer to the man's chest, its body curved protectively around him like a silent guard. Snow continued to settle along the dog's back, but it did not shake it off or move away. Daniel studied the animal for a moment with quiet respect. Loyalty like that could not be trained alone. It came from somewhere deeper. He looked around the clearing once more and spotted several fallen branches scattered beneath the trees, half buried in snow. Slowly, he stood and walked a few steps to gather them, snapping the thinner pieces carefully with gloved hands. Within a few minutes, he had a small pile beside the fallen tree. From the side pocket of the backpack, he pulled out a small lighter and knelt again, arranging the twigs into a tight bundle. When the flame finally caught and a faint orange glow appeared between the branches, the warmth felt almost miraculous against the cold air. The small fire crackled softly, its light flickering across the snow and tree trunks around them. Daniel settled back beside the man, keeping one eye on the flames and the other on the slow rhythm of his breathing. The dog remained close, steady and silent. Above them the storm continued to fall, but within that small circle of firelight, 3 lives waited together in the quiet winter forest. The small fire crackled softly beneath the leaning pine, its thin orange light flickering across the snow like a fragile promise. Daniel Carter fed another dry branch into the flames and watched the sparks drift upward before disappearing into the falling snow. The warmth was modest, But in the freezing forest, even a small fire could mean the difference between endurance and surrender. He leaned closer to the man again and listened. The breathing was still there. Slow, uneven, but present. Each breath formed a pale cloud in the cold air before fading into the quiet. Daniel nodded slightly, as if acknowledging a silent agreement between life and time. The German shepherd had not moved far. The dog remained pressed against the man's side, its body curved protectively, its thick coat absorbing the falling snow without complaint. Occasionally the animal lifted its head, scanning the forest with calm alertness, ears pivoting at the smallest sound. Daniel noticed that the dog never wandered more than a few inches away from the man, not even when the fire first lit. Loyalty like that spoke louder than words ever could. Daniel reached into the backpack again and pulled out the thermos. The metal felt icy against his gloves. He unscrewed the lid slowly, releasing a faint curl of steam into the cold air. Whatever was inside was still warm. He poured a small amount into the cup built into the lid and held it near the man's face, careful not to rush. "Easy now," he murmured quietly, the same steady voice he once used when guiding nervous recruits through difficult terrain. "You are not alone." The man stirred faintly again. It was a small movement, barely more than a shift in the shoulders, but it was enough to keep hope alive. Daniel dipped 2 fingers into the warm liquid and gently touched it against the man's lips, letting a few drops reach his mouth. The response was slow, but after a moment the man swallowed. The dog watched the entire exchange with quiet intensity, its amber eyes moving between Daniel and the man as if understanding every careful motion. Daniel allowed himself a small breath of relief. Even the smallest response meant the body was still fighting. The wind shifted again, pushing a colder gust through the trees. The fire bent sideways briefly before settling back into its steady glow. Daniel pulled the collar of his shirt higher against his neck and glanced toward the thick forest surrounding them. The snowfall had grown denser, the trees beyond the clearing now little more than pale silhouettes behind a curtain of white. If anyone was driving along the road now, they would see nothing beyond the edge of the forest. No firelight, no movement, just snow. Daniel understood what that meant. Out here, survival often depended on patience more than speed. He looked at the dog again and gave a quiet nod. "You held the line all night, did you not?" he said softly. The shepherd tilted its head slightly at the sound of his voice, but did not leave its place beside the man. Daniel studied the animal's posture, the steady breathing, the calm focus. Somewhere deep inside, the soldier in him recognized the same quiet determination he had seen in fellow Marines during long nights on watch. Not loud courage, not dramatic heroics, just the simple refusal to walk away when someone else needed you. Daniel reached out again and gently rested his hand on the dog's shoulder. The warmth beneath the thick fur surprised him. "All right," he whispered, glancing once more at the falling snow and the fragile circle of firelight around them. "We keep him here. We keep him breathing. And when the storm passes, we walk him out together." The fire cracked again, steady and stubborn against the cold, while the storm continued to fall beyond the trees. The fire had settled into a steady rhythm now, thin flames weaving through the small stack of branches while a quiet glow spread. Across the snow beneath the leaning pine, Daniel Carter kept his hands close to the warmth, turning them slowly to bring feeling back into his fingers. The cold had a way of working through layers when a man stayed still too long, and the storm outside the circle of light showed no sign of slowing. Snow drifted through the branches in soft white sheets, landing silently on the forest floor before joining the growing blanket around them. Daniel glanced again at the man beneath the emergency blanket. The slow breathing continued, faint but present, each exhale a fragile cloud that disappeared into the winter air. That alone was enough to keep Daniel focused. The German shepherd remained close beside him, its body still pressed along the man's side like a silent guardian. Occasionally the dog lifted its head, nose testing the wind, ears turning toward distant sounds Daniel could not hear. It was the quiet vigilance of an animal that had already accepted responsibility. Daniel reached for another piece of wood and slid it carefully into the fire. The flames responded with a soft crack and a brief rise in warmth that pushed back against the cold air around them. For a moment the forest seemed almost peaceful. Then the wind changed again. A stronger gust pushed through the pines, shaking loose a cascade of snow from the upper branches. The powder fell in a soft rush around the clearing, dusting Daniel's shoulders and the dog's back. The shepherd blinked once and remained exactly where it was. Daniel gave a small breath through his nose, something close to a quiet laugh. "You are stubborn," he said softly, his voice low enough that it blended with the whispering wind. The dog turned its head toward him, amber eyes steady and calm. Daniel studied the animal more closely now. The coat was thick and healthy beneath the snow, the posture confident even in the storm. This was not a stray wandering the mountains alone. This dog had training, discipline, the same kind of quiet control Daniel had seen in military working dogs years ago. He glanced down at the man again, noticing the worn leather collar peeking from beneath the man's scarf. A small metal tag hung from it, half hidden under frost. Daniel brushed away the ice gently with his glove until the engraving caught the firelight. One word stood out, clearly in the flickering glow. "Ghost." Daniel looked slowly from the tag to the dog beside him. The shepherd's ears twitched at the faint sound of the metal moving. "Ghost," Daniel said quietly. The dog lifted its head fully now, eyes focused on him. There was no mistaking the recognition. Daniel nodded once, as if confirming a detail in a report. "That is your name, then." The dog gave a soft breath and settled again beside the man, as if the conversation had already been understood. Daniel leaned back slightly and looked toward the dark forest beyond the firelight. The storm had thickened further, the trees now barely visible past 20 yards. The road was somewhere beyond that wall of white, hidden behind wind and distance. Even if Daniel attempted the walk now, he knew the truth. The snow was building quickly. Tracks would disappear within minutes. If he left the clearing, he might never find this exact place again. He rested one hand near the fire and spoke quietly into the cold air. "So we stay until morning." The words carried no doubt. Beside him, Ghost remained still, the steady warmth of the dog's body protecting the man through the growing storm while the fire crackled softly against the falling snow. The storm deepened as the afternoon faded into the gray stillness of mountain evening, the kind of slow quiet that came before darkness settled fully across the forest. Daniel Carter sat beside the small fire, feeding it carefully with the last of the dry branches he had gathered, watching the flames curl and snap against the cold air. Each crack of burning wood sounded louder in the silence between gusts of wind. Snow continued to fall through the tall pines in steady sheets, drifting down like pale feathers and covering the clearing inch by inch. The world beyond the firelight had become a blur of white and shadow. Daniel glanced at the man beneath the blanket again. The breathing had grown slightly stronger now, not fast, but more regular than before. Each breath lifted the edge of the emergency blanket just enough for Daniel to see that the body beneath it was still fighting. That was all he needed. He shifted his position and rubbed warmth into his hands again before leaning closer to the fire. The German shepherd named Ghost remained exactly where it had been for hours, pressed against the man's side with quiet determination. Snow had built along the dog's back and shoulders, but Ghost seemed to ignore it entirely. Only the slow movement of the animal's breathing showed that it was alive beneath the white dusting. Every few minutes Ghost lifted its head and scanned the forest with calm awareness, nose working gently in the cold air. Daniel had seen that kind of watchfulness before. It was the behavior of a partner who refused to sleep while someone else needed guarding. The wind shifted again, pushing a stronger gust through the clearing. The small fire leaned sideways for a moment, the flames bending low before rising again. Daniel reached for another stick and nudged it carefully into the glowing coals. The warmth expanded slightly, pushing back the cold that crept steadily through the trees. For a long time none of them moved. The forest held its quiet rhythm. Snow falling, fire cracking, slow breathing beneath the blanket. Then the man stirred again. It was not much, only a faint tightening of the fingers inside the gloves and a shallow turn of the head. But Daniel saw it immediately. He leaned forward, his voice calm and steady. "That is it," he said softly. "Stay with us." The man's eyes opened briefly, only halfway, unfocused and dim in the firelight. His gaze drifted slowly across the clearing before stopping on the shape beside him. Ghost lifted its head the moment the eyes moved. The dog leaned closer and gave a gentle breath near the man's cheek, as if answering a silent call. The man's lips parted slightly. No clear words came out, only a weak sound that disappeared into the cold air. But the moment was enough. Daniel felt a quiet relief settle in his chest. Consciousness meant the body had not given up. Ghost lowered its head again beside the man's shoulder, the dog's calm presence filling the space between breaths. Daniel leaned back and looked toward the dark forest beyond the firelight. The storm still moved through the mountains, but somewhere above the clouds the light of evening had begun to fade. Soon night would arrive. The coldest hours were still ahead. Daniel rested his hands near the warmth of the fire and studied the two figures beside him. One man fighting to stay awake. One dog who had refused to leave him behind. In the quiet glow of the fire, Daniel understood that the night ahead would test all three of them, and none of them would face it alone. Darkness settled slowly through the forest as the final gray light of the winter afternoon faded behind the mountains. The fire beside the fallen pine glowed brighter now against the deepening shadows, its small circle of warmth pushing gently against the cold that crept across the snow. Daniel Carter watched the flames carefully, feeding another narrow branch into the coals so the fire would not fade too quickly. Every piece of wood mattered now. The storm still whispered through the trees, but the wind had softened slightly, turning the falling snow into a slow drifting curtain that shimmered in the firelight. The man beneath the blanket shifted again, a faint movement that Daniel noticed immediately. He leaned forward and listened closely. The breathing was still steady, slow but stronger than it had been earlier in the day. That alone felt like a quiet victory in the middle of the mountain storm. Ghost remained beside the man without hesitation, the large German shepherd lying close enough that their shoulders touched beneath the blanket. The dog's body heat was steady, its breathing calm and measured. Occasionally, Ghost lifted its head and looked toward Daniel, then toward the forest beyond the firelight, as if measuring the night around them. Daniel had long ago learned to respect the instincts of working dogs. They sensed changes in the world that people often missed. For a moment, the forest held a strange peacefulness. The wind moved softly through the upper branches. The fire cracked quietly. Snow drifted down without sound. Then Ghost's ears lifted sharply. The dog raised its head and stared into the darkness between the trees. Daniel noticed the change immediately. He turned slowly, following the direction of the dog's gaze. At first he heard nothing except the wind and the faint hiss of falling snow. Then, far beyond the clearing, a distant sound drifted through the mountains. It was faint, almost swallowed by the storm, but Daniel recognized the rhythm instantly. The low echo of an engine somewhere high in the sky. Daniel stood slowly, his eyes searching the dark clouds above the trees. The sound faded for a moment, then returned again, slightly clearer this time. A helicopter, somewhere far above the forest line, moving. Through the storm, Daniel felt a small surge of hope rise in his chest. The highway patrol sometimes sent search teams into the mountains when storms trapped hikers or drivers. It was possible someone had already reported the missing man. But the trees were thick here, and the snow swallowed sound quickly. If the aircraft passed too far overhead, the crew would never see the small fire burning beneath the branches. Daniel looked down at Ghost. The dog remained alert, its ears pointed toward the sky, as if it too recognized the distant machine. The man beneath the blanket stirred faintly again, his eyes opening slightly in the glow of the fire. Daniel knelt beside him and spoke calmly, his voice steady against the quiet night. "You hear that?" he said softly. "That is help looking for you." The man's eyes moved slowly toward the sound above the mountains, though his focus remained weak. Ghost leaned closer beside him, the dog's steady warmth never leaving his side. The helicopter sound faded again as it moved somewhere beyond the ridge, its distant echo swallowed by the storm clouds. Daniel remained still for a moment, listening carefully to the quiet forest. The engine noise disappeared into the distance, leaving only wind and falling snow behind. He lowered himself back beside the fire and added another branch to the flames, keeping the light alive beneath the trees. Then he looked toward the dark sky once more and spoke quietly into the cold night air. "All right," he said. "If they are out there searching, we make sure they can find us." The fire crackled softly as the three figures waited together beneath the snow-covered pines. Daniel Carter sat beside the small fire and listened to the silence that followed the fading helicopter. The mountains had swallowed the sound again, leaving only the steady whisper of falling snow and the soft crackle of burning wood. For several seconds, he kept his eyes on the sky above the pine branches, hoping the distant engine might return. But the night air held nothing now except wind and darkness. Daniel exhaled slowly and looked back at the man beneath the emergency blanket. The faint light from the fire reflected across the man's face, revealing the pale exhaustion that came from hours spent in freezing conditions. Yet the breathing continued. Slow, steady. Each breath lifted the blanket. Slightly before settling again, Daniel leaned forward and spoke in a calm voice meant to keep the man present in the moment. "They are out there," he said quietly. "We just have to help them see us." Ghost remained beside the man as still as a carved statue, though the dog's ears continued to turn toward distant sounds that Daniel could barely detect. The shepherd's posture had not changed all evening. Loyal, alert, patient. Daniel glanced toward the small pile of remaining branches near the fire. They would not last the entire night if the storm continued this way. He stood slowly and moved toward the edge of the clearing, scanning the ground for more fallen limbs beneath the snow. The forest was darker now, the shapes of trees blending into a wall of shadow. Daniel stepped carefully, brushing snow aside with his boot until he uncovered several thicker branches that had fallen earlier in the season. He gathered them under his arm and carried them back toward the firelight. When he returned, Ghost briefly lifted its head, watching him with calm approval before lowering it again beside the man. Daniel knelt and fed the new wood into the fire one piece at a time. The flames brightened immediately, rising higher and casting stronger light into the clearing. The snow around them glowed softly in the flickering orange glow. Daniel studied the fire thoughtfully. A stronger flame might be visible from above if the helicopter returned. But the trees were thick, and the smoke might disappear into the storm before reaching the open sky. He looked again toward the dark ridge beyond the forest. Somewhere above those clouds, the aircraft crew might still be searching the mountains for signs of life. Daniel reached into the backpack and removed the reflective emergency blanket that had been folded beneath the man earlier. Carefully, he lifted one corner and angled it toward the fire so the metallic surface caught the light. The reflection flashed briefly across the clearing like a mirror catching sunlight. Daniel nodded slightly. If the helicopter returned, even a brief reflection might catch the pilot's attention through the trees. Behind him, the man stirred again, a faint sound escaping his lips as his eyes opened slightly. Daniel returned to his side immediately. "You are doing fine," he said softly. "Just stay with us." Ghost leaned closer once more, the dog's warm body never leaving contact with the man's side. Outside the small circle of firelight, the storm continued its quiet march through the mountains, covering tracks and swallowing distance. Yet inside that fragile pocket of warmth, three lives waited together with stubborn patience, keeping the fire alive and watching the dark sky for the sound that might return. The fire burned brighter now, its flames climbing higher as the thicker branches Daniel Carter had gathered began to catch. The clearing beneath the leaning pine glowed with steady orange light, a small island of warmth surrounded by endless white forest. Snow continued to drift down through the branches, but the wind had softened, turning the storm into a slow, silent fall instead of the harsh gusts that had filled the afternoon. Daniel sat close to the fire, one hand resting near the warmth while his eyes moved constantly between the man beneath the blanket and the dark sky above the trees. The man's breathing had grown stronger again, the rhythm no longer as fragile as it had been earlier in the day. Each slow inhale lifted the reflective blanket slightly before settling back down. Daniel noticed the change immediately. "That is good," he said quietly, his voice steady and reassuring. "Just keep breathing." Ghost remained beside the man without hesitation, the large German shepherd lying so close that their shoulders still touched beneath the blanket. The dog's presence had become a steady force in the clearing, as dependable as the fire itself. Every few moments, Ghost lifted its head and listened to the forest beyond the light. Daniel had begun to trust those silent signals. If the dog sensed something, it meant something in the mountains had changed. For several long minutes, the only sound in the clearing was the soft crackle of burning wood. Then Ghost's ears lifted again. This time the dog rose slowly to its feet and looked toward the sky beyond the treetops. Daniel noticed instantly. He stood beside the fire and followed the direction of the dog's gaze. At first he heard nothing, only the whisper of falling snow. Then the faint sound returned. A distant engine, low and steady, echoing somewhere beyond the clouds. Daniel stepped out from beneath the thickest branches so he could see more of the sky between the trees. The sound grew slightly louder this time, clearer than before. The helicopter had returned. Daniel felt a sharp surge of hope move through his chest. He quickly grabbed one of the larger branches and pushed it into the fire, stirring the coals so sparks rose upward in a bright shower of orange light. The flames flared higher, reaching toward the dark canopy of pine branches above them. Ghost stood beside the man and watched the sky with intense focus, the dog's ears locked on the distant engine. The man beneath the blanket stirred again as the brighter light flickered across his face. His eyes opened slowly, unfocused but aware of the movement around him. Daniel knelt beside him once more and spoke calmly. "You hear that again," he said softly. "They are still searching." The helicopter sound moved closer, the engine echo now strong enough to carry clearly through the storm. Daniel lifted the reflective emergency blanket again and angled it toward the firelight, turning it slowly so the metallic surface flashed in bright bursts toward the sky between the trees. For a moment nothing changed. The helicopter continued past somewhere beyond the ridge. Then the sound shifted slightly. The engine slowed. Daniel froze and listened carefully. The rhythm of the aircraft had changed. Instead of moving away, the sound circled somewhere above the forest. Daniel looked up through the snow-filled darkness and allowed himself a small breath of relief. Someone in the sky had finally seen the light below. The sound of the helicopter deepened above the forest, its engine now circling somewhere beyond the thick winter clouds. Daniel Carter stood beside the fire and listened carefully, his eyes moving across the dark sky between the tall pine branches. The aircraft was no longer passing over the mountains. It was searching. The rhythm of the engine shifted again, slower now, as if the pilot were turning wide circles above the ridge. Daniel fed another branch into the fire, pushing the wood deeper into the glowing coals until the flames rose higher. Bright sparks lifted into the air, carried upward through the falling snow. For a moment the clearing glowed brighter than it had all night. Ghost stood alert beside the man. The German shepherd's ears pointed sharply toward the sky. The dog had not barked once since Daniel first arrived in the clearing, but the animal's posture now carried a quiet excitement, the same focused energy Daniel had seen in trained working dogs when they sensed a change in the mission. The man beneath the blanket stirred again, his breathing stronger now that warmth surrounded him. His eyes opened slowly, reflecting the firelight with faint awareness. Daniel knelt beside him once more, keeping his voice calm and steady. "They see us," he said quietly. "Just hold on a little longer." Above them the helicopter engine grew louder, its deep vibration now echoing through the trees. Daniel stepped forward into the open portion of the clearing and lifted the reflective blanket again, angling it toward the firelight so it flashed brightly toward the sky. The metal surface caught the glow and sent sharp bursts of light through the falling snow. For several seconds nothing changed. The helicopter continued circling somewhere above the storm clouds. Then the sound shifted again. This time it grew stronger. The aircraft was descending. Daniel felt the vibration in the air before he could see anything through the thick canopy of pine branches. The wind from the rotor blades had not yet reached the forest floor, but the engine noise now filled the mountains with a deep, steady hum. Ghost moved closer beside Daniel, standing tall and watching the sky with intense focus. The dog's tail lifted slightly, though the animal remained perfectly calm. The man beneath the blanket turned his head faintly toward the sound above, his breathing quickening slightly as awareness returned. Daniel placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "That is your ride out of here," he said quietly. Through a break in the clouds far above the trees, a faint beam of white light suddenly cut through the falling snow. The helicopter's searchlight swept slowly across the mountainside, drifting over the dark forest until it reached the clearing below. The beam paused for a moment as it caught the bright reflection of the fire and emergency blanket. Then the light returned again, stronger this time, holding steady over the small circle of flames beneath the pine branches. Daniel looked up into the brilliant glow and allowed himself a long breath of relief. High above the forest, someone had finally locked onto their signal. The searchlight from the helicopter held steady over the clearing, a bright column of white cutting through the falling snow and illuminating the small world beneath the pine branches. Daniel Carter shielded his eyes for a moment as the beam moved slowly across the fire, the blanket, and the two figures resting on the ground. Above the forest canopy, the deep thump of rotor blades grew louder, the sound echoing through the mountains like distant thunder. The aircraft could not land among the dense trees, but the crew had clearly found their signal. Daniel knelt beside the man again, keeping his voice calm as the storm swirled around them. "They have you now," he said quietly. The man's eyes opened slightly wider in the glow of the fire and searchlight. His lips moved, though the words were still too weak to carry clearly. But the awareness in his expression had returned, and that was enough. Ghost remained pressed against him, the German shepherd unmoving even as the powerful beam of light washed over the clearing. Snow blew sideways through the air as the helicopter circled lower above the ridge. The wind from the distant rotor blades began to reach the forest floor in soft waves, stirring loose powder from the branches overhead. Daniel stood and lifted both arms into the light, signaling upward so the crew could clearly see him. The searchlight shifted slightly, then returned again, holding steady over the fire. A moment later, another sound joined the thunder of the helicopter. Faint voices carried through a loudspeaker above the trees, distorted by wind and distance, but unmistakable. A rescue team had arrived. Daniel turned back toward the man and placed another branch into the fire, keeping the flames strong and visible. Ghost rose slowly to its feet now, the dog standing tall beside its owner, as if recognizing that the long night of waiting was finally ending. Snow continued to fall around them, but the clearing felt different now. The silence of isolation had been replaced by the presence of people searching the mountains overhead. Daniel knelt beside the man one more time and adjusted the blanket around his shoulders. "You did the hard part," he said quietly. "You held on." The man's eyes moved toward Ghost, resting there for a moment before closing again in exhaustion. The German shepherd lowered its head beside him, giving a quiet breath that carried warmth into the cold air. Minutes passed as the helicopter maintained its position above the ridge. Then new lights appeared deeper in the forest beyond the clearing. Small beams moved between the trees, weaving slowly through the snow. Rescue workers had begun hiking in from the road below, following the helicopter's signal toward the firelight. Daniel watched the moving lights approach through the darkness and felt a quiet sense of relief settle across the clearing. The night was no longer theirs alone. Beneath the falling snow, the small fire continued to burn steadily, its glow guiding the rescuers through the forest toward the three figures waiting beneath the pine tree. The beams of the rescue team's flashlights moved steadily through the dark forest, growing brighter with every passing minute as the men and women worked their way through the snow toward the clearing. Daniel Carter stood beside the fire, watching the lights weave between the tall pine trunks like small stars moving through the storm. Above the mountains, the helicopter continued to circle slowly, its searchlight holding steady over the clearing as if guarding the small pocket of warmth below. The deep rhythm of the rotor blades echoed across the snowy ridges, a reminder that the long night of waiting was finally coming to an end. Ghost remained beside the man on the ground, the German shepherd's body still pressed close to him even as the approaching lights flickered through the forest. The dog's ears turned toward the voices now drifting faintly through the trees, but it did not move away from its place. Loyalty had kept the animal here through the coldest hours of the storm, and that loyalty had not changed now that help was close. Daniel knelt beside the man again and adjusted the emergency blanket one last time, making sure the warmth from the fire still reached him. The man's breathing had grown stronger over the past hour, steady and patient like someone who had crossed the hardest part of the journey and was finally moving towards safety. His eyes opened briefly again as the sound of approaching footsteps reached the clearing. One of the rescue workers called out through the snow, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet forest. Daniel stood and raised his arm toward the lights. Within moments, the first members of the search team stepped into the clearing, their winter gear dusted with snow and their flashlights cutting bright paths across the firelit ground. They moved quickly but calmly, kneeling beside the man and checking his breathing, speaking to him in steady, reassuring voices. One of them looked toward Daniel and gave a small nod of gratitude before continuing their work. Ghost stepped back slightly, but remained close enough that its warm breath still reached the man's shoulder. The dog watched every movement with careful attention, as if confirming that the people who had arrived were there to help. The rescuers worked with practiced efficiency, preparing a stretcher and wrapping the man in additional blankets to protect him from the cold during the journey back to the road. Daniel stepped aside to give them room, the warmth of the fire now resting behind him as the clearing filled with quiet activity. Above them, the helicopter maintained its slow circle, its lights still shining through the falling snow. After several minutes, the rescue team lifted the stretcher gently from the ground. The man's eyes opened once more, and this time his gaze settled on the German shepherd standing beside him. Ghost moved forward and touched its nose softly against the man's hand before the rescuers began carrying him toward the forest trail. Daniel watched them disappear slowly between the trees, the line of flashlights guiding the path through the storm. Ghost turned once more toward Daniel, its amber eyes calm in the firelight. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then the dog gave a quiet breath and followed the stretcher into the snowy forest, staying close beside the person it had refused to abandon. Daniel remained beside the fading fire and looked up at the dark sky where the helicopter continued to circle above the mountains. In the stillness of the clearing, he understood something simple and powerful, the kind of truth that only revealed itself in quiet places far from the noise of the world. Sometimes the strongest acts of courage are not loud or dramatic. Sometimes they are simply the choice to stay beside someone when the storm is at its worst.